All right. Well, hi everybody.
Hi, Mr. Seth.
Hello.
How did how do we start this? I don't know.
It's fine. I mean, if we want to have like one person do the intro every time or trade or it's whatever.
Okay.
Um,
Well, so this is the second episode of our podcast.
yes.
Um,
Yes, we didn't decide on a name, and I think it's still a kind of tentative name. We didn't even decide on that until one or two, no, last night. Last night, which is why episode one has not gone up yet, because I couldn't do the intro for episode one until I knew what I should call it. So, yes, we're at episode two. They'll go up together.
What did we decide on?
we didn't.
Didn't we both all agree on something like hose, dough, and heresy, something, something, sacred scripture?
I'm fine with that.
I mean, whatever is fine. Yeah.
I'm
Honestly, I think actually that version's even better. Hose, does, and heresy, something, something, sacred scripture.
I think, yeah, let's do it.
We'll call it a temporary name. And anyone who happens to listen that comes up with something better that's not too insulting, we might actually consider. So,
Okay.
Cool.
yeah. So that's sort of, I guess, what we're going with. And we actually decided on something of a format to prevent, to some extent, some of the chaos of last time.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Best laid plans.
Erica,
But
your skin looks really good.
it does actually.
No, you know what? I don't know why. But thank you.
Are you using like a mask or something?
No, I don't use anything. My skin's too oily.
Oh,
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's just Italian skin.
that's true. Okay, so we're starting with the Saints Day.
Yes. What saint are
Cool.
we learning about today, Seth?
So there's a few saints this week, but I don't know a super lot about any of them. Today's saint is Leonard of Noblack. I don't know anything about him at all. And yesterday we had the gunpowder plot that sort of eclipsed two sort of important saints, the parents of John the Baptist, Zacharias and Elizabeth. Um, but the saint that I picked out that we talk about sort of briefly is Carlos Borromeo, whose feast day was on Monday, the 4th. And this guy, a lot of people, I don't know, at least on my social media, a lot of people posted about Carlos Borromeo yesterday or Monday, which sort of surprised me because he's not a saint that
Wow.
I feel like I think about all that much. I grew up knowing his name because there's a California mission named after him. That's actually kind of an important one. It's where Junipero Serra is actually buried at San Carlos. And interesting about that mission, it's the only mission that's not named after either a biblical saint, a martyr, or a Franciscan. They chose Carlos because the King of Spain's name was Carlos, so they did it kind of in honor of the King of Spain. But San Carlos himself was a reformer. He was bishop of or Archbishop of Milan during the Reformation period. And so he kind of got the job because he was related to the Pope, but then he ended up being one of these guys who, really took it seriously. And he was so successful in his reforms in Milan that he was pretty unpopular because people didn't want to reform. So he got into some tiffs with people. And his biographer says that he was very kind of austere and not super warm and fuzzy. So That's kind of funny. But yeah, so that's who we celebrated on Monday. And actually, I think the Pope even, well, I'm sure the Pope always says something about a big saint that's celebrated on a day, but it popped up on my social media. He was saying something about Carlos Borromeo, probably because of the whole idea of reforming and education and stuff like that. So.
Now, I had heard of Carlos Borromeo earlier, but I'm not sure in what context. I feel like I heard a lot about him when we were in college for some reason.
Maybe. He's really important for like the Council of Trent era.
Mm.
We didn't read him in college.
Maybe he had something to do because there was, a lot of music history happened around then, so maybe he.
Oh, that could be.
Maybe he was one of the people fighting for or against music in the liturgy at all.
That's possible.
He was a third order Franciscan. All right, I take back what I said. I'm just looking at his thing right now. But they still chose him for the mission because he was the same name as the king. Yeah, he worked with plague victims. Oh, you know what? The other reason that I know Carlos Borromeo is that he gave first communion to Saint Aloysius. So
there you go.
You see them pictured in art together a lot.
Okay.
And that's probably the context then that I heard of him.
Yeah, that could be.
So
interesting.
Since he's a saint, is he the patron of anything in particular or any places or?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that because I just looked that up. He's the patron saint of like seminarians and stuff like that because he was, in the Council of Trent when they set up the seminaries for the education of priests. But he's also the patron saint of apple orchards. And I'm not sure why that is.
Awesome.
I know.
I love that.
Weird.
So, when people are praying for the seminarians or the seminaries in their local diocese, or perhaps they have a relative who's in seminary, Charles Borromeo is a saint they can hit up for additional assistance. Or if they're going apple picking and they want some fantastic apples.
Right. I may go apple picking on Sunday, so now I'll know who to.
Now you know to ask St. Charles
Borromeo for good apple picking.
Yeah. And to bless the orchard that you visit.
Right.
That's awesome.
I have here, I don't know if I was stuck on the seminarians and the apple picking. Did you say catechists? Because they have him here.
Yeah, catechists as well. I just said seminarians
cool.
and apples because that's what I was most concerned about.
Is he the only patron saint of catechists?
I would be surprised if that's the case.
That's neat.
I feel like there's a lot of overlap with some of these patrons.
Okay, so did you have anything else to add on St. Charles? Or
No.
Okay, then I will move into, we're also going to be doing a heresy of the week, just because I'm fascinated by the subject, and I think a lot of lay people don't know a lot about, various ideas that have already been discussed and dismissed, whether rightly or wrongly, but I guess I have to say rightly. Whatever, I'm a rebel. And I think it's good to go over these. So I was wanting to do something sometimes that, I would do a heresy that had some connection to whatever saint Seth would present, because a lot of, especially the early saints, have a lot of overlap with the early heresies, a lot of fighting and such. But in this case, Charles Borromeo was just around the time of the Reformation, and I didn't want to just, hit Protestantism in general, because that's a tough thing to tackle. But Seth did suggest the Petrobrussians, who are sort of several centuries before the Reformation, but they're sort of a bit of a precursor, and there's sort of that indication that there was always a bit of discontent, and the Reformation wasn't a sudden thing, really.
Mm.
So they were headed up by a guy called Peter of Broyes, and he was from France. He was a teacher, and he criticized infant baptism, opposed the erecting of churches and the veneration of crosses, opposed the doctrine of transubstantiation, and denied the efficacy of prayers for the dead. And an angry mob killed him around the year 1131. And most of our information about this guy is derived from a treatise from Peter the Venerable and a passage by Peter Abelard, who are both also interesting people in their own right. So a little more detail. So on like what he taught, he gained adherents at Narbonne, Toulouse, and Gascony primarily, and he was cool with the Gospels. Like he was like those literally, yes, absolutely, those have doctrinal authority. But the rest of the New Testament, he doubted that they were actually written by any of the apostles.
Dude, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So he had a problem with the canon in general?
Yeah, so the New Testament epistles, he was like, they're subordinate to the Gospels because they didn't come from Jesus Christ, but from humans. And he wasn't certain about the Old Testament either.
Whoa.
And he rejected the authority of the Church Fathers and the Roman Catholic Church in itself.
Yeah, I knew that.
So when they list his errors in the accountings of him, the first error he had was they deny that children before the age of understanding can be saved by baptism. Only one's own faith together with baptism can save someone. So that really went counter to a lot of the Latin West, and following what Augustine had taught about the baptism of infants and children and how that helps them with original sin. The second error, and the article I'm reading says that this had some exaggeration when it was written down, that the edifices for temples and churches should not be erected. That his followers were quoted as saying, it is unnecessary to build temples, since the church of God does not consist in a multitude of stones joined together, but in the unity of the believers assembled. Whereas on the other hand, the medieval church taught that cathedrals and churches were created to glorify God, and believed it appropriate that those buildings should be as grand and beautiful as the wealth and skill could make them. The third error enumerated that is attributed to Peter. It's enumerated by Peter the Vulnerable to his Peter of Broyes' followers. They would command that sacred crosses be broken in pieces and burned, because the form and instrument by which Christ was so tortured and slain was not worthy of any adoration or veneration or supplication, but for the avenging of his torments and death it should be treated as unseemly dishonor, cut in pieces with swords and burnt in fire. And this was considered this was considered to be an iconoclastic heresy, which in a later episode we can get into iconoclasm as its own heresy. But it's basically the idea that anything that is that can be considered a graven image or a man-made image of anything living is violates the commandment that the Lord says you will have no graven images of gods. So that's how the church was seeing his dismay about crosses and how they should be treated. The fourth error that Peter the Venerable lists is the Petrobrussians denied sacramental grace, rejecting the rite of communion entirely, let alone the doctrine of the real presence or transubstantiation, and basically say that they were like, Eucharist out. It's not even a thing. And the fifth error was that they derided sacrifices, prayers, alms, and other good works by the faithful living for the faithful dead, and say that these things cannot aid any of the dead, even in the least, that good deeds of the living cannot profit the dead, because transferred from this life, their merits cannot be increased or diminished. So basically the concept of praying for the souls in purgatory was something that they denied. So then, that causes a lot of upset and uproar. And around the year 1126, Peter was publicly burning crosses in Saint-Gilles, near Nîmes, and the local Catholic populace, angered by his burning crosses, tossed him into the flames of his own bonfire.
Oh, wow.
And that's how he died. And so there was Henri of Lausanne, I guess was his a student or follower of his who had been a monk. And he sort of adopted those teachings and modified them a bit and started passing them around a bit. But then they started to die out around 1145, and which is the year that our guy, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, began reteaching for return to orthodoxy in southern France. So soon afterwards, Henri was arrested, brought before the bishop, and imprisoned for life. And Bernard basically goes around and convinces everyone else, for the most part, to come back to the church. There's also a young girl who claimed to have been inspired by the Blessed Mother, who converted a great number of people back to Roman Catholicism. And then the Petrobrussians and the Henrichians, who were the ones who followed Henri, they sort of disappear from history after that. There's no evidence that the Petrobrussian teachings influenced Protestantism like directly, but some evangelical Protestants and the Anabaptists sort of call back to him as sort of a forebearer or prophet of the later Reformation.
Yeah, right.
So that's for a little known heresy. That is an interesting thing that even, in those centuries, people were causing a ruckus about some of these teachings. And then that St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who's one of my personal favorites, put a stop to that mess. So that is our heresy of the week.
Ooh.
Yeah, right?
I love a good heresy.
See, that's why I want to discuss these, because then, you can, learn about all the different whack ideas. Or, there are some times that I'll read about heresies and I'll go, but I'd want to see the arguments made, because I can definitely see why people would think that. And how did they then argue that this was not the case?
Yeah, right.
Especially with a lot of the early ones, or of course some of the early heresies. I read and I'm just like, I don't even understand these distinctions people are making. And so maybe when we get to some of the Christological heresies, we can discuss them.
Well, I was just thinking of Arius. Arius had an interesting thought as to
well,
the being of Christ, and I think Arius got a bum deal.
At least I would like to see the reasoning laid out, and not just because St. Nicholas punched him out and therefore won. I don't necessarily buy into that thought, but I'm fascinated by the philosophical arguments. And as we've discussed before, Erica, you and I, sometimes the church historically has had a problem distinguishing between people speculating out loud and people teaching something, which seems
Yeah.
to be what they did with Origin. He was speculating out loud and never actually taught the things he was wondering out loud about. And then they came back later and they're, after he died, oh, he taught these things. Nah, he was just spitballing, dudes. He was brainstorming.
Well, even I think, not to get too much into Arianism because we'll do
Yeah.
that later, but as you say, if you get to the nitty gritty, like if you get to the basis of Arius's confusion,
Mm-hmm.
it almost makes sense. I mean, it's not so out there as we may want it to seem. So, yeah, I think we condemn too quickly and listen just never enough.
Yeah. So, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So
we will get to Arius.
We absolutely will. Erica, what do you have for us?
Okay. So I'm kind of connecting Seth's discussion about the saints with some heresies, but also I'm going to be the one to talk about the elephant in the room this week, the gunpowder. What is that? Gunpowder plot.
The gunpowder plot.
The gunpowder plot.
I wish I had some.
I know,
ammo
it's
up
an
in here.
entirely different problem. So two contemporary, I would say contemporary. I mean, 2005, right? That's not that old. A movie and a TV series. And the reason that I love the movie so much is because aside from the content and what it's discussing, it is just a really, really, really well done movie, and the dialogue is amazing. So, V for Vendetta, made in 2005. It's rated R. Do not show this to your tots. Teenagers, I think teenagers could probably handle it, but not for tots.
Yeah.
2 hours and 12 minutes of goodness. And if you like The Matrix, Agent Smith, Hugo Weaving, is actually one of the title characters, and he's absolutely genius in it. But the point of it is it does involve V, who puts on a Guy Fawkes mask and is aiming to blow up Parliament, but mostly out of oppression. So V for Vendetta takes more of a spin on overthrowing governments that are hurting the people, that are too rigid, that are dictatorships, that are turning into just monsters for the general public. And it's all about civil disorder in a very boomy, uncivilized manner, I suppose. So V for Vendetta is a little bit less about religious conflict and more about oppressions and immorality in society. I would definitely recommend it, especially if you love, movies like The Matrix. I think everything about it is, it has brilliant little pieces. It's a complicated plot, and Natalie Portman's also in it. She's very good too. The other one, which ties in a little bit better, is a TV series that I happened to come across. I think I saw it on HBO. It was originally a BBC production put out by our friends across the pond. Excuse me. And it came out in 2017 over there. It was released, I think, in 2018 stateside, and it's called Gunpowder. And it takes on really more of the historical aspects of what happened in the gunpowder plot. And part of what I found really, really interesting is the character of Guy Fawkes is in it, but he's not the main character. So the main character is actually Robert Catesby, and he was a Catholic. But he was a Catholic. I'm not going to tell you the whole thing. It's 3 episodes long, so watch it if you get a chance. But Robert Catesby was a Catholic who married a Protestant woman. They were madly in love. They had kids together. He was very mellow. He was not like very stringent, super Catholic during his time of being married to his wife, but his wife died. And it was after his wife's death that he really intensified in his Catholicism and became very, very fanatical about it. So this was at a time, early 1600s, so 1500s going into 1600s, and England is at war with Spain, and the Protestant government is killing all of the Catholics in very bloody, very brutal ways, which you Protestants, we did it to you too. So, I'm not saying that it was all your fault. But as the story goes, Catesby is a nobleman. And he is, once his wife dies, he is fed up. He is done. He's tired of the persecutions. And so he seeks out Guy Fawkes, and together he and some of the priests form the Gunpowder Plot. So you'll have to watch the rest of the series to see how it turns out. But it is a very excellent series. And if you're looking for something with historical accuracy, I would say this would be the series to go to. Again, like, especially episode 1, absolutely not for kids. Make sure those little ones are far away from that TV, because we are getting like torturous, gory. Wow. I mean, it kind of puts the drawn quarter scene in Braveheart to shame. So if you have a weak stomach, it did get some bad press for being too over the top and being too gory. So, but people still watched it because the historical accuracy and everything was really, really well done. So,
is it streaming somewhere? Like, is it on HBO now or something?
I believe if you have HBO Go, I think you can still see it, but you can also see it on any BBC iPlayer, which also means that Apple might have it as well.
Is it on Amazon yet?
Let me look.
Because I know when my father and I watch Doctor Who, we usually watch it off BBC America, but I know then it later becomes available on Amazon.
And the funny thing is, it did not play on BBC America. It went to HBO. I'm sure HBO bought it. Yeah. So you can get it. It's actually on Amazon Prime. Okay. And if you do the free trial with HBO, you can watch it and then cancel your free trial so you don't have to pay for it. Don't tell anybody I said that, but you can totally.
It's a great tip.
It's pretty cheap on Amazon too, so.
Okay.
And it's not a high commitment time. 3 episodes,
How long are the episodes? About like an hour?
I want to say an hour.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, hour and a minute. So, and for you Game of Thrones watchers like I am, Kit Harington, Jon Snow, King of the North. He is the main character. He plays Robert Catesby, and it's all yay! And for you Aerosmith fans, Steven Tyler's daughter, Liv Tyler, also Arwen, Lord of the Rings. Yes. She plays one of the main characters as well, and they are both absolutely fantastic and excellent in it. So highly recommended.
Okay.
And if you want to teach your children, because my kids are little, they're 3 and 8. If you want to teach your kids about the Gunpowder Plot, read them the poem of Chidiock Tidborn, because all of this is ridiculously violent.
Yeah, it says that people complained because of depicted scenes of torture, nudity, and disembowelment.
So anyone who actually enjoyed Game of Thrones would totally dig it.
Would probably like this a lot.
I know. I feel like, when did this come out?
2017.
Okay. I mean, I feel like we see stuff like that all the time, so.
We do. I have to say that even this, like, horror movies are kind of my thing. I love a good slasher film. Blood and guts don't bother me. But the beginning, it is a woman who is being tortured, and it's pretty brutal. It's pretty brutal. So I get why people were kind of upset that they went to that length.
So I would probably not enjoy it so much.
No, not that first episode.
The
That bit is not that long. You could
Okay.
totally skip over, fast forward through that bit, and
Skip
watch the rest of it. Yeah.
Skip through the torture.
Yeah, again, my problem with Game of Thrones was, I guess, not at the beginning, but after a while, I just got tired of it. So, okay, so we can definitely check that out. And take a look at that. I do remember watching V for Vendetta years ago, and then most people these days recognize the Guy Fawkes mask as the favorite mask of dissidents everywhere.
Yes.
Everyone likes to wear Guy Fawkes in a mask now.
And I read some complaints about, some of the rabble rousers, if you will, wearing Guy Fawkes masks, but I think it really does come more from the popular culture idea of Guy Fawkes than it does straight from the gunpowder plot. Yeah. And most of what I read about the gunpowder plot is actually really, really inaccurate, which is why I think if people want to know what really transpired, they should go and watch Gunpowder if they're unwilling to read about it. Because it's not, it wasn't just the Catholics being jerks or just the Protestants being jerks. It was a very complicated time with a lot of war going on, and people unhappy with their government, people unhappy with people being tortured, and this is what was born of it. So to oversimplify it, I think like we do on social media is, not doing it justice to what actually happened. So, but those are my recommendations.
Good call. Okay. So, Seth, you had one other topic you wanted to discuss this time.
Yeah, I thought, I guess it sort of goes along with what we've been talking about, but I was hesitant to talk about this. It sort of exploded on social media. I guess it was last week, the theft of the Pachamama statues from the Amazonian Synod. And it really blew up here in the U.S., especially on social media. I know a number of people that I follow posted things about it. And the reason that I thought maybe we could bring it up this time is because it's very in the news right now, and also because, I'm not sure when it happened, but very recently the person who actually did the theft came forward on social media and claimed the action and is asking for social media followers, and did an interview with, I believe it was National Catholic Reporter, about the theft. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there if there were any thoughts about it or what.
Well, I think I expressed in our group chat that I absolutely approved of his and his boys' actions. Everything I've seen surrounding those figures really set me on edge, and every official statement from the church made it worse. So I am in favor of what he did. Because because I remember at first people were like, okay, what are these? Are these, images, sort of native indigenous interpretations of the Blessed Mother? And they're like, no, it's Pachamama. And then people were saying, okay, well, what is Pachamama? And the way they described it was pretty much every anthropologist talk on the universal goddess, which has no place in the Catholic Church. And I found it I found it dismaying that not only were they there, But there were photos and videos coming out of people prostrating themselves before these images, these idols, and that perturbed me.
Yeah. Oh my God. Sorry.
Cat explosion.
Seriously, I don't know what's going on. Anyway, I decidedly did not say anything about this on my social media because I don't feel like I know enough about Pachamama or the history or how it's been used in the Amazon. I was uncomfortable with the action for two reasons. Firstly, because I don't know enough about it to whether it was appropriate or not. I spoke to a friend of mine who's a priest and who's of Mexican descent who said that the enculturation aspect of it troubled him. And I think that if you look at, any like Virgin Mary, especially Our Lady of Guadalupe, there's a lot of crossover with goddesses and Tenochtitlan and things like that. So whether that's going on in other places, but again, I don't know enough about it to really make any kind of statement. What bothered me about it was that until the guy came forward, this was all anonymous. And so it seemed to me, oh, Jesus, cats, please. They're like going nuts. All right. It seemed to me like a social media stunt. And the fact that they did it anonymously, I feel like, if someone's going to stand up for the gospel, do it, like have your face on it and take the reprimand that you get. Like, I know enough religious and priests and lay people who've gone to federal prison for quote unquote standing up for the gospel that I'm not super impressed by someone who does it anonymously on social media. And even now that he has revealed himself, I feel like, what are they going to do to him? I don't know. I sort of feel like it was a cheap way of going about it. But at the same time, I understand from the interview, I see where he's coming from, and I see why people had, had some reservations about it. Again, I don't know enough about the image to really give my opinion on that, but my criticism of it was the way in which he went about it.
I understand that now when you say if you're going to do something, own up to the action.
Right.
Why leave it anonymous? Yeah, I totally agree with that, because then I question why he left it anonymous for the time period that he did before he came.
The reason he gives in the interview, which is something I actually really understand, and it honestly probably would have been my instinct. And I say this because his reasoning was he didn't want it to be about him. The men who did this, the group of them, didn't want it to be about themselves. They wanted it to be about the action and about removing idols from the church and defending the church from paganism. And that the reason he waited until the synod was over to then show his face, because as Seth was saying, you also have to have the courage of your convictions to show your face and put your face and your name to the actions. And I have some sympathy for that argument because I note that we ourselves in our own podcast, because we don't want it to be about our personalities, we are not putting our faces up. I mean, you can find our faces, I'm sure, online, but we're doing this as a podcast, and anything that goes on YouTube is not going to have the video recording with it. Again, because we don't want it to become about Erica and Seth and Christine.
I agree, but his whole point, his conviction was to make change, right? His conviction was to take the idols out of the church. Mm-hmm. And yet my opinion is that he is young and foolish, honestly. After watching the
Maybe.
interview, he came across as, and he even says it. He says, I am very young. And I think he shows a lack of experience and a lack of judgment in doing things that are very difficult. Expressing the fact that, first of all, okay, let me take a step back. I don't know why the statue was there to begin with. Like, that doesn't totally make sense to me. To be in the Vatican Museum, I could understand that. To be in a Catholic museum, to be at Loyola's Catholic Museum, I understand that. But who put it in the church to begin with? Okay, so I'm going to leave that on the table for everybody to wonder about. I think the next thing that kind of bothers me is that he had an opportunity with the synod going on to say, I did it, this is why, and let's talk about it. And he didn't. So then social media is talking about it around it. I mean, we keep letting social media dictate, and I'm not talking about podcasts or the interview he did. I'm talking about like Facebook,
Twitter,
Instagram.
and Facebook, yeah.
Instead of making it official so that something could be officially tackled on the subject. So I don't know how I feel about him doing it. I don't know that I would have done it. I think I would have gone a different route, even though I don't understand why it was there to begin with. But I think what bothers me absolutely the most, more than anything, is the fallout that this has in other areas. So any time in the church, and I think this is, Seth can probably tell you from sitting in class after class, part of the worst thing about dealing with Catholics, I'm Catholic, is what happens after something like this breaks out. So I was able to find, just by trying to read up on the Pachamama, because I didn't know much about it either, and just trying to find it, I came across right after he threw the idol into the Tiber, there was a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Mexico City that was burning effigies of the Pachamama in the church. Okay, fine, whatever. It's a little tasteless, but whatever. My problem, hold on. My problem is what he said, though. And this is a direct quote from him. A French exorcist says that this idol is actually the figure of the Antichrist. It is a blasphemy and parody of Mary. Pachamama is pregnant but carries the Antichrist to give birth to him in the Masonic Church to destroy the sacraments, which is to return to idolatry and superstition. So this Antichrist, who is to give birth to a church with an Amazonian face, is an abomination. It is a contradiction to church doctrine, which is the dynamic into which these idolaters want to enter in now. Like that statement, he's a priest. He has been through seminary, and yet that is the most arrogant and ignorant statement. Does it contradict church doctrine? Yeah, I'm sure some of the things, like you say, having idols in the church, but to say that the church doesn't have an Amazonian face, to say that Mary can't have an Amazonian face, I think is totally inaccurate. To lead to the Antichrist? Oh, God, just stop it. Stop.
Right. Next he's going to be telling us that Harry Potter teaches witchcraft.
Yes. And so this is my biggest complaint out of this whole thing, is that now we have lit a fire for all of the freaks who want to take everything to this supernatural level again, to just go with it because somebody threw an idol into the Tiber. And I will leave it there because I think this is the fallout of the issue. Instead of doing things smartly, we just let all hell break loose. And then, is this 24-year-old going to deal with all of these priests taking this to an extent that it wasn't meant to be taken to? No, he's not, because he's a 24-year-old who did something, because he had a passion for it. So I don't know. Oh, hello, meow.
That's what Myth has to say.
So yeah, well-meaning. I think he was well-meaning. I think that he did what he absolutely thought was the right thing to do, which I don't necessarily disagree with. But I think he didn't have the foresight to think about the repercussions of his actions. And obviously, we can have a discussion about seminary training at another time. But yeah, those are my 10 cents.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. Well, we are getting close to an hour, even though we're going to probably it'll probably be it'll be less than that once I'm done editing. Anyone else have any final thoughts, final words?
I feel like we had a good discussion.
Yay!
Me
I
too.
think we brought up a lot of good things, and maybe people can come up with their own ideas about what we've had to say.
Awesome.
Bottom line, do your research, folks.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And no more hostage situation, no more apocalypse in the background. All of us made it all the way through this time. Hooray!
A minor cat apocalypse, but I don't think it was too disruptive.
Okay, well, it was very good, and we will stop the recording now.